So, if you have a podcast this year, do you need a website? Let's have a conversation about that. So, I want to explain to you whether or not you should have a podcast website in the first place. And if you do, what are the pros and cons? Okay, I want to give you a complete guide to podcast websites. Here's an overview I want you to think about. Big question is, does your podcast actually need a website in the first place? Not really. No podcast needs a website, but the benefits of having one are almost too good to ignore, especially if you are in a very competitive, niche, if you will. Okay. One of the big strengths of a podcast is that they actually exist in so many different places. And this is kind of cool because having a presence on so many digital assets is going to help your content actually be discovered, be explored, but also be expanded into different geographies. And this is an important element to think about. And so when I speak about actually having your content existing in so many different places, this is kind of cool in terms of versatility because you create one by signing up to a podcast hosting provider. And that's the place where all your episodes are uploaded, distributed, and stored. Once your podcast exists, it can actually be found in a plethora of directories and apps dedicated to listening and curation. Apple and Spotify are actually the big two, but other popular platforms include Podchaser, Overcast, and Podcast Addict. Okay, so that's kind of cool. And so one thing I want to say here is that when it comes to podcast websites, you have to really understand that your podcast overall has no shortage of couches to sleep on, but you might want to give it a home on its home of its own. That way, listeners can come visit, and you can decide on the food, the drinks, and the wall art. Think about it. When someone visits your show on a directory, they'll see the basics like your title, artwork, description, and a list of episodes. But when someone visits a podcast website that you actually run, you can actually curate their experience. This is useful in all sorts of ways, from monetization, like selling products and services, to presenting your best episodes front and center on a Start Here page. And your podcast website is that one single place to send people for everything. And I mean everything, okay? No more find us on iTunes, hit us up on Twitter, or now called X, support us on Patreon, blah, 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 blah. You can add all those links to your website and then just send everyone there because, again, you control everything. And from a branding perspective, that's kind of cool too because it gives you more freedom, more autonomy, if you will. Let me talk to you about the technique you want to implement this year if you are thinking about having a podcast website. How do you make your own podcast website in the first place? There are actually three best options. The site that comes with your podcast hosting, okay? You have also a podcast website maker tools, and also you have building a podcast website using WordPress. I want to talk to you about the first one, the site that comes with your podcast hosting. It's actually worth mentioning on top of that in most cases, you'll be gifted a basic podcast website the minute you create your show in your hosting account, right? Whether you go with Captivate or another player, you have this possibility. And the cool thing is that the vast majority of hosting providers actually give you the ability to create a podcast website for free. So you don't have to actually think about things like hosting, storage, and so on and so forth. You have this native ability to have a podcast host, to have a podcast website right off the bat. And so that's kind of cool. The quality and customization options vary pretty dramatically, though. It depends on the pricing tier you're in, okay? So it's one of those things where you have to see what works for you. But based on our investigations, Captivate is actually a standout when it comes to podcast website right now because they actually this platform gives you a certain depth and breadth when it comes to design and growth options for this type of podcast website. And again, I'm speaking here about your ability to actually scale real fast too. Okay. Now, of course, when you think about having a site that comes with your podcast hosting, you might have also some downsides. Not everything is actually a positive. Now, the downsides of a podcast host generally of a podcast host website generally include things like you have limited design customization compared to a site you own in the first place, right? Because from a branding perspective, you're kind of limited. And also, you have limited add on tools compared to a plugin marketplace like WordPress. But these downsides are really often worth it because the sites require basically no setup, are entirely free, and are run and maintained by the hosting company. So couldn't be really simpler when you think about it. Another option you can actually try this year when it comes to podcast website is that you want to have a podcast website maker tools. I mean, a set of tools, not just one tool, but you can have a variety of tools. So an increasing number of services will automatically build a podcast website for you, so long as your podcast already exists. So that's kind of cool because basically you are outsourcing the design, the creation, the maintenance of that website to a third party. Okay, so that's kind of cool. I mean, you can have a hosting provider such as Transistor actually having this capability as well. Okay, and but you can also try another player such as Podpage, and Podpage has been around for a while now, and the company has many tools and features built in, including options to receive listener voicemails, build a mailing list, track analytics, write a blog, collect comments, offer memberships, and a lot more. The thing about the website hosting for your podcast is that you have to really understand what you're trying to really get from the platform. How are you trying to monetize things? Because see, a podcast is first and foremost actually a business, right? You are a businessman or a businesswoman, so you have to really think about the scalability aspect of things, but also the monetization aspect of things. So you can try Podpage, for instance, for you to have an idea of what you can do with this player. Or you can also think about Podcast Page. This is another podcast website builder that actually works in much the same way that like the same way as Podpage. And so when you think about Podcast Page, Transistor, or Podpage, those tools actually tend to have more extensive design and customization options. So you can actually make the sites that you really want, okay, in the first place. Podpage, for example, has every feature you will ever need as a podcaster, as well as features and tools you might not even have considered yet, right? So this is what you want when it comes to having a bespoke presence. Yet podcast website makers are actually third-party services, so you won't technically own your podcast website outright, but there is a huge advantage to not having to maintain the site's nuts and bolts yourself. Instead, it's run and maintained by the tool maker, so that alone is a huge plus. You can also try to build a podcast website using WordPress or Wix. I mean, it really depends on what you really want to have, okay? Building your own WordPress website can actually give you the ultimate freedom. I mean, of course, you got to have this actually entails additional resources, or you might actually have like do it yourself. If you have some WordPress knowledge, this is kind of programming or coding, you can actually go this route too. But basically, you have an ultimate freedom because you have unlimited design and customization options. You can do everything. I mean, everything you can think of, you can actually do it if you build a podcast website using WordPress or Wix. You can add tools for just about anything, and it's a site that's entirely your own and under your control. Okay. A popular route is to sign up for web hosting with a company like Bluehost and then build your website directly in their WordPress platform. Of course, with ultimate freedom and customization options comes the risk actually of accidentally breaking stuff and constantly tinkering with things that you're never quite happy with, right? Now, so this option isn't really difficult, but equally, it's not exactly for the faint-hearted, especially if you want to focus only on your content, on your podcast career or your podcast sort of gig. Then the last thing you want is to actually play around with website building or WordPress website hosting, for instance. I mean, you can actually try. I mean, if you want to do things, if you want to build a podcast website using WordPress or Wix, you have a constellation of tools to help. Okay, you can actually check out a couple of theme providers. For example, Second Line Themes actually has a collection of excellent templates that are actually plug and play on any WordPress websites. They add players, subscribe buttons, share buttons, and more, which really help to turn a basic site into a podcast promotion machine, which is what you should have in the first place. You can also use your website on Wix, which many consider easier for non-techie and beginner folks. But again, the downside is that you reduce your options around plugins, layouts, and branding. So if you are a company or a network, then building on something like WordPress makes a lot of sense. Equally, if you are, let's say, if you're looking to take your podcast seriously in the future, even earn a crust from it, then you really will really benefit from the extra growth tools, monetization options, and branding flexibility. Okay. But for most beginners or anyone just podcasting as a creative outlet, then a third-party platform like Podpage will be easily good enough to build a great podcast website and save you a whole lot of time and stress and even resources in the first place. So that's kind of important to think about. Let me give you a few bonus tips here. How do you add a podcast to your website in the first place? So if you already have a website, right? Let's say you have a website and you just have you just have podcasting as a side gig, and you are trying to really centralize things now. You're trying to officialize things now. So if you already have a website, don't worry. You can use it as your podcast home. That's for sure. Now, no need to create yet another thing to look after, right? This is obviously based on the caveat that your website and podcast topics are the same. Otherwise, it'll be very complicated to centralize things. It'll be a bit odd to send listeners to your your GNOME appreciation website to check out your podcast about high intensity interval training, for instance, right? So there has to be some kind of commonality here. So let's say you run a business and your new podcast is going to be a marketing tool for that business. You already have your own site, so you can use that as your podcast website too. You just need to create a podcast category or a section, and that's totally possible. And so what happens here is that you are going to have things run efficiently. So when you release a new episode, create a corresponding post on your site for that episode. Things are happening in the background automatically. The title will be the same or at least very similar. You will then add in your show notes and any images and embed the episode player from your hosting account too. Now you have a post on your website that you can share every time you release new episodes. That's kind of cool. When you think about it, that's really good in terms of flexibility, but also scalability. This means what? It means the bulk of the traffic comes to you, which means you can also tailor and optimize your listeners' experience on your site. And think about the revenue. Think about the change this can have on your balance sheet, on your cash inflows and cash outflows, for instance. On top of that, you will reap the SEO benefits of more traffic, more searchable content, and a more discoverable website and business going forward. Okay, so one thing I have to say here before closing this section is that there is a difference between a self-hosted WordPress site, which is WordPress.org, and a WordPress.com site. The latter is really a light hosted version, and you might be unable to do even basic player embeds on the platform. So if you are using WordPress as your podcast website, then you want to sign up for web hosting via a company like Bluehost and set it up that way, okay? Now let's talk about hosting your podcast on your website. I've actually answered that question on another show, but it's one of those things where I want to quickly talk about it here. I mean, why upload your episodes to one place, your hosting account, only to embed and share them in another, your website? You can actually upload media to your website after all. So why can't you just host your podcast there? Well, basically, the key reason is that you have to think about delivery and demand. That's what I call the 2 Ds, okay? Now, when I speak about delivery, think about it. Audio files are very big, and hundreds or even thousands of listeners could be trying to access them all at once. This can easily lead to a website crash or a furious web hosting service reaching out to you saying, I know we said unlimited bandwidth, but we didn't mean that unlimited, okay? So you do not want to think about that aspect of things. So it's one of those things where you have to think about the listener experience, the LX. And you also have to think about the fact that dedicated hosting providers are actually built to robustly handle the distribution of audio files all around the web. They can actually serve as many files as people want at any one time. So that's kind of cool in terms of scalability, but also in terms of immediacy, the speed, okay? And so in the end, what you have here is that you are able to beef up your Alex and you're able to actually forge a better relationship with your listeners going forward. And so when you think about dedicated hosting providers, they are also completely unaffected by any time your podcast website goes down, which does happen because listen, the whole thing about 100% uptime guarantee doesn't exist. Okay. And so when you think about it's like you are basically outsourcing the hosting provision to a third party. Okay. And this can actually be a big weight off your shoulders. And if you are actually running a podcast, you are going to have a lot of challenges, and you do not want the last thing you want to have is to actually waste your time actually worrying about little things like that. Now, when I talk to you about the podcast websites, does your podcast website need a domain name in the first place? Well, it depends on what kind of branding you want to have. Because just like websites, you don't need a domain name, but buying one makes total sense. It's actually the final cherry on the cake of your one place for everything approach. So buying one is all part of the setup and sign up processes. I mean, for when it comes to hosting companies like Bluehost and Wix, and you can buy and add a domain name to point to your pod page website too. Okay, this is kind of cool. So for show notes, subscribe links, and the various ways you can support the show, head on over to blah right? And you can buy domain names for a few dollars per year, though they can get very expensive based on how sought after they are. And please also think about the renewal prices. The renewal prices can be really pricey as well, okay? And I mean really crazy pricey. So be very careful there. And so one thing for sure, when it comes to domain names, .coms are the most memorable and tend to be more expensive because so many of them are already taken. You can save money on something like a .net or a pretty much anything else these days, okay? There are actually a few best practices to consider when buying a domain name for your podcast website. And one thing for sure, you want to avoid hyphens, okay? Your domain should be memorable, easy to read, and free from ambiguity too, okay? For example, if you wanted a number in your domain name, you might need to buy two versions of the domain, one with the number and one with the number spelled out, and point them both to your website. So like literally everything else in podcasting, make it easy for your audience and you will reap the benefits. As I said a little earlier, it's all about your Alex. It's all about your listener experience. So if you are actually doing things from the listener's, let's say, a point of view, you will realize very soon that you are actually adding so much value. You are actually solving pain points for your listeners that you are going to build a podcast machine real fast. And you are going to have a community, a very loyal community who will follow you no matter where you go, no matter whether or not you actually host your podcast on your own website or on a third party website. You will have a very loyal customers. So what are the closing arguments here? In today's conversation, I give you a complete guide to podcast websites. I give you the overview, the technique, the bonus tips, and now the closing remarks. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.